welcome everyone. Good afternoon for the people here at JTLU, and good morning, maybe good evening if some of our colleagues are joining us from other places in the world. Today we have the honor to have with us Professor Susan Jacobs with a presentation, Land Use and the Forest Water Nexus in Kenya's Mau Forest Complex, Insights from a Decade of Monitoring. About the speaker, Susan has a background in environmental science for the Utrecht University of the Netherlands and forestry at the University of Göttingen and Bangor University in the UK, followed by a PhD in hydrology at Justus Liebig University. She was research associate at SOI before getting a chair for land use systems with focus on agroforestry at 2024 at JTLU. Susan's research focuses on interactions between water and land use. She studies how humans affect water availability and quality through, for example, agricultural and land management, particularly in the tropics. She is also interested in how land use systems can be made more resilient to climate change, especially in the context of droughts and future water availability. She investigates this using a variety of field-based methods ranging from low-cost participatory approaches to in-situ sensors. Most interesting are multi- and interdisciplinary projects where the water component is embedded in the large context that also includes other environments as well as socioeconomic and governance aspects. The talk of Susan will last for 30 to 40 minutes. So with this says, Susan, the floor is open to you.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and again, welcome to everyone here and online. Some of the aspects that Alicia mentioned, which are my interests, is in investigating the effect of land use on water and using in-situ sensors, and that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. On behalf of the whole team that's behind this project, the focus will be on the forest-water nexus. Forest and water are intricately connected through assumptions like water regulates water availability by storing a lot of water during rainy seasons or during wet periods and releasing this water slowly during dry periods, maintaining good amounts of base flow. It filters pollutants from the water through their intricate root system and also helps to create precipitation or water availability in case of large forested areas with high evapotranspiration. However, a lot of forests make place for agriculture, either for small farmers or for intensive agriculture, and also for settlement. And the question is, what's the effect on water resources? In this project, we look specifically at the Mau Forest Complex. The Mau Forest Complex is in western Kenya. It's actually located on the western side of the Rift Valley, the East African Rift Valley, which you see here on this map. And it's about 400,000 hectares large. There are a lot of political issues around the forest area. People have invaded it, people have been evicted again, and there's been cases of land grabbing as well, making it a topic of interest for a lot of different people. At the same time, the forest is the source for 12 major rivers in the region, flowing into different important ecosystems, like for example Lake Nakuru National Park, but also the Masai Mara ecosystem, which eventually becomes the Serengeti ecosystem. And many of these rivers also flow into Lake Victoria, where the lake is an important source of livelihoods for many people around there, which means that also the amount of water and water quality are very relevant for these people. At the same time, the area is not only important for agricultural production for smallholders, but also for tea production. There is some large-scale tea farming going on in certain regions, including in the brown area here around Kericho. In this orange area, the Sondu Basin is exactly the area where we're focusing on. It's one of the rivers flowing into Lake Victoria with its headwaters here in the Mau Forest. Now, there's been a lot of forest loss in the Mau Forest Complex over the last decades. And this has resulted in statements like deforestation has caused droughts and floods. We've seen many articles in different newspapers, both national and international, on one side related to agriculture, farmers, local people complaining that there's not enough water anymore, but also in terms of tourism, where the wildlife in the Masai Mara and Serengeti ecosystems are suffering from lack of water, or where tourists get stuck in their camp because of too much water. This means that water availability in the area has a big impact on people's livelihoods. On the other hand, what we've also seen in recent decades is that many lakes in the Rift Valley have an increasing water level. maybe a little bit contradictory. This is a desert lake, and this has an increasing water level, and therefore people are suffering from flooding. Rainfall is one of the explanatory factors. We see here water level increase in Lake Nakuru National Park, or Lake Nakuru. We see a little bit of increase in rainfall as well, but it's not the only factor that contributes, or that's likely to contribute to this increasing water level. There have been studies that show that the change in forest cover, particularly an increase in forest cover, has also contributing to water storage in the basin and therefore lake water levels. And this nexus leads to a lot of research questions. In our case, I mean, of course, there are many ways in which you can investigate the role of forests in regulating water. We're using high-resolution data, meaning data recorded at 10-minute intervals in different locations, to on one hand study the short-term and long-term patterns in water availability and water quality, but also to evaluate their relationship to land use and what is driving these different patterns that we're seeing. So to learn a little bit more about the area we're working in, I'll start with a short introduction to the three dominant land use types in the regions. One, of course, is the Mau forest itself. It's a tropical montane forest or an afro-montane forest. And based on a study from 2016, it has experienced, as I mentioned, a lot of conversion of forest to smallholder agriculture. In this period, about 25% of the forest was lost and 22% of the smallholder farming area has increased. Also, like it's about 10 years ago now, so maybe not as accurate anymore, another study identified a lot of forest degradation, so not only forest loss, but also the quality of the forest is reduced, affecting about 18% of the forest cover in the Mau forest. And the main reasons were charcoal burning, but also collection of firewood and livestock, or going into the forest with the livestock for livestock grazing. Surrounding the forest, the area is dominated by smallholder agriculture. This is a mosaic of cropland and pasture, which you can see on this picture here in the middle. And people mainly grow annual crops. Cash crops would be maize and potatoes, but they also grow beans, cabbages, and other small amounts of like green leafy vegetables, for example. And here and there you see a patch of tea as well. Tea is also a cash crop in the area. In addition, the people keep cows, sometimes on their farms, but they also take them to the forest and they're walking around, therefore also having the opportunity to empty themselves in the river, of course, with potential implications for water quality. Farmers use relatively low amounts of fertilizers, though actually every farmer that was questioned in a household survey in 2019 indicated that they use artificial fertilizers. And what is very typical for this area is that the riparian zone, so the vegetation along the rivers, is very degraded. There is vegetation, but you also see a lot of paths going to the river where people come and grab water, they do their laundry, they wash their motorbikes, and the livestock come and graze there. Yet, these streams, together with shallow wells, are an important source of water for these people, hence the importance of water availability and water supply. Then, as you saw on one of the first slides, we also have tea plantations in the area. These are large commercial tea plantations run by multinationals. It's about 20,000 hectares in total. And a tea plantation is actually kind of mosaic of tea fields like these ones with eucalyptus plantations looking like this, up to like 8-9 years of age, because that's the rotation time. And these eucalyptus trees are used for firewood processing. The ratio tea to eucalyptus is about 3:1 to 5:1, so more tea than eucalyptus. In contrast to smallholder farming areas, we see that the riparian zone is actually quite intact. We have a lot of native vegetation and it's also protected. However, what is not as good is the high fertilizer use. The tea plantations or the tea companies, they do an aerial application of fertilizers, applying 150 to 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, although they adapt it to the needs of the plants and the soil. And there are some sections which are designated for organic tea production as well. And I have to say here that fertilizer application has reduced in the recent years because of increasing fertilizer prices and also some environmental concerns by the tea companies themselves. If we look at the climate in the region, we're looking at about 1,800 millimeters precipitation at 2,100 meters. That's at this weather station here. We have a bimodal rainfall pattern, meaning we have two rainy seasons. One is here, April, May, June. although officially for Kenya they say the rainy season is March to May, long rainy season. And then we have a second rainy season, which is usually indicated by October to December, but we see here in the monthly rainfall that actually September is already the starting point of this short rainy season. But there is a high unpredictability in terms of rainfall onsets. We're close to the equator, which could mean that daily mean temperatures, they don't fluctuate very much during the year. We see slightly warmer maximum temperatures in the dry season and slightly lower temperatures during the minimum temperatures during the intermediate season between the two rainy seasons. And also within the study area, we see differences in rainfall patterns, which I will highlight later on as well. So now what did we do, or how did we want to investigate this effect of land use on water availability and quality, is we set up a hydrological or hydro-meteorological monitoring network. This basin is part of the Sondo Basin. It's called the Chemosit. And we selected 3 sub-catchments within the area. One is almost completely characterized by smallholder agriculture, one by tea plantations, and here one by natural forest. The outlets of each of these 3 sub-catchments, as well as the larger catchment, were instrumented with an automatic measurement station, which I will explain in a moment in more detail. In addition, we had a number of rain gauges to capture the gradient in precipitation from here down at around 1700 meters up to 2600 meters elevation. And we had a number of weather stations, so we could also measure parameters like temperature, humidity, and wind speed and direction. As I mentioned, the outlet was also instrumented, but it got flooded in 2020, so we had to stop monitoring there. And in general, due to availability of resources, COVID, etc., the monitoring was not continuously at all sites during the whole decade of monitoring. So the results that you'll be seeing will be based on available data. So looking in more depth at the automatic measurement stations, this is a general setup. This is the station at the forest site. We have the basis for the station, which is a box which contains the data logger and a battery system. It has solar panels on top and lightning protection. Then there's cables running to this installation next to the water, where we have water quality sensors, which look like this. We have one for turbidity, total and dissolved organic carbon, and nitrate. And we have one for electrical conductivity and temperature. And then above the water, we have a water level sensor to measure distance to water level, which we then can convert through the relationship with actual discharge measurements to discharge, so the amount of water flowing past every second. Inside the box it looked like this. These are the batteries to store the energy, the data logger where the data is stored and where you can go manually to download data. If you're lucky enough to have a mobile phone network, it can also transmit the data automatically, but here in the forest that's not really an option. And then you see here automatic cleaning system, and this is because we have sediments and particles in the rivers that like to settle down on the sensors, which would influence the measurements. So every 10 minutes this would send some air to the sensor to blow away any particles just before the measurement would take place. This is, however, not enough, and people would still have to go there on a weekly basis to clean the sensors and to remove like more persistent fouling of the sensors. Good. Looking into precipitation and discharge, we see a lot of variability between years, a little bit also between the different land use types. Here you see the availability of number of years for which we have data for the different catchments. The forest has a little bit more discharge compared to the other 2 land use types. And what is very notable is the reduced precipitation the smallholder catchment receives compared to the other 2, even though it's at higher elevation. But it's quite typical for tropical mountains in Africa to have an increase in precipitation up to around 2,300 meters, and then the rainfall decreases again. So this is not very unusual. We also see a large variability in the timing of peaks of discharge. As I mentioned, this is our long rainy season, and we see high differences, some years with a lot of discharge and some years with less discharge. We see funny peaks here either in September, but also in October, November, and December. This is, for example, a flood event in December 2019, and even a very rare, unusual peak here in January 2024. And on one hand, you could talk about climate change, of course. A lot of people are complaining about changes in the onset of the rainy season, and therefore difficulty in predicting when they should be planting. But it's also related to more regular climatic drivers, which include the Indian Ocean Dipole Index and also the relative oceanic, or like the El Niño-La Niña cycle. which are represented in the two graphs here on top. And we see that especially combined events lead to rather unusual patterns in the discharge, which is here shown for the natural forest catchment. So for example, El Niño presence enhances the short rains, which is something that we saw in 2015. We have a much higher peak here at the end of the year compared to many of the other years. On the other hand, La Niñas, they induced drought conditions, and there was a very dry season in 2017. While a positive Indian Ocean dipole index induces very heavy short rains, resulting in the peak flood events in 2019, which was also historically extreme. Then if you combine the effects of both cycles, we get increased flood risk, like here in 2024. We have a massive peak here towards the end of the year, or actually beginning of 2024. And two negatives together resulted in a very long dry spell from 2020 to end of 2022. So land use effects that we might be observing might also be confounded by climatic influences and the differences between the catchments themselves. Nevertheless, the data has shown us some interesting things. One of them is catchment behavior. So what happens to the rain that falls? How fast does it become discharge? And one of the ways to look at it is to look at the flow duration curves. We sort all the discharge, so how much water is flowing out of the catchment, from high discharge to low discharge, and we can calculate the percentage of days in which a certain level of discharge is exceeded. And we see actually the behavior of the three catchment, the thick line of the mean of all the available years, is actually very similar for the three catchments. But what is interesting is that during this very dry year, 2017, we see that discharge is actually very low for a very long time of the year compared to the other two catchments, which have a higher discharge. We also see that the curve is much steeper here at the upper end, suggesting that the catchment is more flashy. It responds faster to rainfall, and you see stronger peaks in the rainfall. On the other hand, we see much more similarity between the tea and the forest catchment, suggesting that they have similar storage capacity and also release water more gradually. That's more looking at an annual pattern. We can also look at individual rainfall events. So what happens if it rains? How soon does the discharge change? How fast does it change? Or how big is the change in discharge? And here we correlated different conditions. On the one hand, characteristics of a rainfall event, so the total amount, the intensity of the rainfall, but also previous conditions, so how much did it rain in the past, or what's the initial discharge, and looked how do they influence the change in water level, the amount of water that was discharged, etc. And we see some differences between the different land use types. First of all, for example, the ratio between the discharge from the event to the rainfall is negatively influenced by the amount of rainfall, suggesting that even if it rains much harder, much longer, much more intense in a natural forest, this effect is buffered, and the amount of discharge that's produced is relatively similar. In the smallholder catchment, we actually see that the preceding conditions, so how much it rained in the past, how wet the soils is, has an influence on the magnitude of the event, meaning that the wetter the soils, the larger the event response. And then in the tea plantations, we don't see very strong drivers, but mostly characteristics of the rainfall event itself, so how much and the intensity influence the response of the catchment, suggesting that there are different processes that played a role in the generation of discharge in the three catchments. So much for water availability. Now let's look at two different water quality parameters. One of them is nitrate. Nitrate is an indicator for agricultural pollution through fertilizers, for example. And here again, I put the discharge. And why is that? It's because we can see very nicely that the nitrate concentration patterns that we see here in the lower graph actually closely follow the discharge patterns that we see here, but only for the agricultural catchments. In the forest, well, not much happens. And this suggests that during the rainy season, there's groundwater flowing into the streams which have enriched the nitrate concentrations from, for example, fertilizers. On the other hand, the conditions in the forest are apparently so stable that this doesn't change during the rainy season. What we also see is that during a very dry spell, there are some notable peaks in the nitrate concentrations as well, and this happens during rainfall events, suggesting that nitrate is accumulating in the soils. It's not washed away, but then the first rainfall event after a dry spell is causing this release of a lot of nitrate at the same time, and this is mainly happening both in the forest and in the tea plantations. If you combine concentration and discharge information, you can also calculate how much nitrogen is exported from a catchment, so how much is lost. And this is what is shown here in the graph on the left. This is again, these are the different patterns in concentrations throughout the year. And here we calculated for different years the total amount of discharge that the catchment had, but also how much nitrogen was exported. And we see that similar to this lack of variability throughout the year, that also discharge doesn't really strongly influence the amount of nitrate that is exported. Unlike the amounts here for the tea plantations and the smallholder agriculture. And what we also see is that similar amounts of nitrate can be exported by smallholder catchments despite lower fertilizer use, depending on how much rainfall it receives and how much discharge is produced. Another issue is soil erosion, indicated by sediment losses and amounts of sediments in streams. During rainfall events, we often see lots of surface runoff. The paths and drains act as conduits of rainwater with a lot of sediments from, for example, cropland heading towards the stream. And it's therefore also not surprising that we see, especially during the long rains, high amounts of sediments being exported, especially in the smallholder agricultural area. Less so in the tea plantations. They have more permanent vegetation. They also try to take measures to reduce erosion. And another notable point is that we see that sediment losses have reduced here for both catchments, but we still see a rather high peak for the smallholder catchment, and this is because the rainfall pattern in this area is slightly different compared to the other two. It receives more rain in this July, August, September period, and less rain during the short rains compared to the other catchments. Now, of course, with sediments, we also lose nutrients because soil from croplands contains nutrients. And then if we look at the total amount of sediments lost from each catchment, of course, smallholder farmers lose the most of their sediments. But in terms of nutrient concentrations, we actually see that the nutrient concentrations are much higher in the forest than in the agricultural catchments. And this suggests that these soils have already been depleted or partially depleted of their nutrients despite the use of fertilizer. Despite these lower concentrations of nutrients in the sediments, if you then calculate how much particulate nitrogen and phosphorus is lost, we still see that the smallholder catchment loses most of its more particulate nutrients compared to the other two land use types. The last aspect with regard to water quality is also a response to rainfall, it's like we did for the discharge itself. Because of course, when the discharge changes, we also see changes in, for example, mobilization of pollutants or maybe dilution of concentrations due to increase of water with a low concentration. And these can be investigated by plotting discharge on the x-axis against concentrations of a pollutant or a substance on the y-axis, and looking how the shape of this relationship changes. Where in this case, like the rainfall event starts with the light color and the darker this is towards the end of the rainfall event. And each different shape gives you an indication of what's the concentration of a source, a solute in the water, but also where does it come from. And I will not go into detail what the different classes mean per se. Maybe interesting to know is that like everything that moves upward is an enrichment of a pollutant or sediments, and everything that decreases is a dilution, meaning, for example, in case of nitrate, that a lot of water from rainfall with a low concentration of nitrate causes the water to dilute, or the river water to dilute, reducing concentrations. We did this again for the 3 catchments and classified each of the events that we had into the different classes, because this again suggests different mobilization and transport pathways. And here again, we see some notable differences. For nitrate, first of all, we see that we mostly have cases of enrichment, meaning that each rainfall event releases a little bit extra of nitrate into the stream, whereas in the tea and tree plantations, we see dilution. And this is maybe contradictive when I say in the previous slides, like more discharge leads to more nitrate in the streams. At the moment of the event itself, there's dilution taking place. It's not the water from the groundwater that's more slowly released into the stream. For a sediment, it's of course not surprising that we don't have dilution. Rainfall events bring a lot of sediments to the stream. This increases the concentration overall. We see slight differences in where most of the events are categorized. And these classes, number 3 and 4, suggest that the sources for sediments are located further away from the river than the sources of sediment for the natural forest. So this was a lot of data, this was a lot of technical stuff. Now summarizing, what did we actually learn from 10 years of monitoring? In terms of hydrological processes, we can state that stream flow is mostly originating from groundwater. We had this increase in nitrate, suggesting this increased connectivity of groundwater and streams in the agricultural catchments. But this was further confirmed by tracer studies, meaning that during the rainy season, we have more groundwater in our streams. In terms of runoff response, so how does the stream dialectically respond to rainfall? We see a buffering effect in the forest. The magnitude of the rainfall doesn't have so much effect on the forest because we have lots of trees, the rainfall is intercepted by the canopy, it's infiltrating better into the soil. But on the other hand, in the smallholder catchment, we find that the wetter the soil, the stronger the response to rainfall is. And surface runoff itself, though we didn't measure it directly, seems to occur mostly in agricultural catchments. And a study also showed that these catchments, different land use types in these catchments, have lower infiltration rates compared to the forest. In terms of water quality, we investigated drivers of short-term patterns, so very quick responses, but also long-term patterns. There's one study that I didn't present here right now, but that was looking at seasonal patterns, but also diel variation. So we don't only have responses to rainfall events, we also have diel changes in water quality parameters driven by biogeochemical processes. And these in turn are driven by temperature and light conditions, so availability to enable certain processes. And at the same time, we've also seen that there's a stronger linkage between changes in hydrology, so groundwater inputs, and water quality in the agricultural catchments compared to the forest catchment. In terms of nutrient and soil loss, it's not surprising that agricultural catchments lose more nutrients and more soil. There's a high likelihood that these increased nitrate concentrations in the streams are derived from fertilizer use. Though we don't have the hard evidence, we didn't trace fertilizers through the catchment. Then we have the higher sediment loads in the agricultural catchments, especially during the rainy season. As I mentioned, there's a lot of drains and paths that bring water with sediments to the streams. And the lower concentrations of nutrients in the sediments in these agricultural streams also suggest impoverishment of soils and soil mining, which is problematic, of course, for future agricultural production. Another aspect which was not shown in the previous slides is stream ecology, because not only hard water quality parameters like nitrate, like turbidity or sediments are an indication of water quality. You can also use stream organisms like macroinvertebrates, and they actually provide a more integrated signal because they have a slower response to water quality or general conditions. So this group from the University of Eldoret, they did several sampling campaigns covering different land use types. And similar to water quality, they found that the land use leads to specific organisms not or being present at certain sites. Not surprisingly, we find higher macroinvertebrate species richness and diversity in natural streams. And there we find especially intolerant or sensitive taxa, which indicate that quick changes in water quality, like negative changes, would lead to these species disappearing from the sites. Therefore, these species are mostly linked to minimally disturbed site. Whereas on the other hand, we also have very tolerant taxa, which can live under conditions with higher nutrients, with more turbidity and less oxygen. And these are more linked to the disturbed site, especially smallholder agriculture. So knowing this, what can we now do? I mean, it seems very clear that protecting the forest is important to maintain the services that the forest provides. One of the things that can be done is making physical boundaries, and that's actually an example here on the left. This is at the lower edge of our smallholder catchments. It borders the forest. This is supposed to be the forest, although this looks more forested. But this was once upon a time also settled by farmers. They were evicted in 2005 to 2009. And slowly but surely the bamboo forest is coming back. But still a lot of people would go there, they would bring their livestock, they would go charcoal burning, etc. To stop that, they first started to create a physical barrier in the form of tea plantations. On the one hand, this provided security because there would be security there 24/7 who could control what could go into the forest. And it provided income for people who worked there as tea pickers, thus as an alternative for example, charcoal burning. And more recently, they also put up a fence, an electrified fence actually, to prevent people from going into the forest and therefore really excluding forest use with the exception of the collection of firewood. You're allowed to get 1 headload per day, I think, and occasional other activities. But there are also other options as well. We have local stakeholders, we have communities which are organized in water users associations and community forest associations, and these have management plans. Currently, lots of them, they're not at all linked, or they're not working together at all. They're often also not aware of what the others are doing. And engaging both of them and making them work together has shown potential to increase the number of activities that can protect both water resources and forest resources. Activities include establishment of tree nurseries to do replanting, for example, along rivers and springs, better management of riverbanks and also catchment rehabilitation. But of course it should also include activities for income generation to prevent people from damaging what has been, for example, planted again. But it doesn't necessarily only have to be management or conservation of the complete forest. The riparian buffer zones are also very important. For example, in terms of the stream ecology, the catchments or the sites with tea plantations scored relatively well because they were shaded, they had intact buffer zones, the streams were in good conditions compared to the smallholder agriculture where we often see riverbanks like this. Legislation actually requires that 6 to 30 meters of the riverbank is protected. And there are different sources of regulations, including the Environmental Management and Coordination Act, the Water Act and the water regulations, but also different institutions implementing these regulations. And the implementation is also not very strict. But this includes, for example, that also the Water Resource Authority is empowered to say that people have to do certain activities on the riparian land like conservation or tree planting. And then finally, if we really want to manage our water sustainably, we don't only need to protect our forests, but also we need data. This is the mandate of the Water Resources Authority, but they have a limited capacity to do so. A lot of water level data is collected manually from water level gauges, such as the one shown here in the picture, although they're increasing switching to automatic stations, but then often the funds are lacking to maintain them, also the knowledge is lacking to maintain them. And also very important is that the data is not publicly available. Participatory monitoring, so engaging, for example, communities in water level monitoring can be used. There are simple methods that work and could also contribute to awareness raising, capacity building and empowerment, especially, for example, in the context of these sub-catchment management plans, which the water users associations make. But so far, like we tried it out in the Sondo Basin and we received limited support from authorities. They want to keep it in their own hands. And also they would like to keep the data because the data for them is a source of revenue. Why am I talking about monitoring? Well, the monitoring we did is not really a solution either. We encountered a number of problems over the last 10 to 12 years, including, as I mentioned, also for the Water Resources Authority, the availability of spare parts and also knowledge to maintain the equipment. Theft of solar panels and batteries requiring 24-hour security, which is quite expensive. Influence of animals, blocking rain gauges, biting through cables, or potentially stepping on your equipment if you're an elephant. But also thinking about how you want to install your sensors is important. Apparently we didn't give it enough thought, meaning that at some point the water levels dropped too much and we couldn't measure anything. And we had to be more adaptive in terms of how we're going to continue measuring during low water levels. Conditions in remote areas are also not very easy. So many sites are not easily accessible. And finally, you have to choose your sites strategically. Sometimes there are some unforeseen events that hinder data collection. And with that, I would like to end my presentation, and I'm open to your questions.